So I probably won't have a lot of time here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my view, my policy about the difference between exposing a non believer or a false believer, a terror, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and a professing believer, a believer who has the testimony of Christ. I do believe there's a difference, even in the way I see it in the scriptures. If somebody has the testimony of Christ and contends for grace, then even if they enter false doctrine, I'm going to be in fear and trembling in how I deal with the situation. And whereas a person who comes against the grace of God, against the testimony of Jesus Christ, and it's clearly manifested, um, they we expose them outright. But someone who claims the testimony, there takes a finer discernment, because now we're wondering, are they really saved? Is it a false testimony? Or is it a true believer that the Lord will deal with? If it's a true believer that the Lord will deal with, He'll discipline them. And we may even be a part of that discipline, but the way we handle them is more careful. If they're a false believer, but they have a profession that you cannot fault, then the Lord will have to reveal it in His time. They'll eventually manifest what they are. Uh, if they are a believer who is going to be dealt with by the Lord, if they're in open sin, then they should be rebuked privately, taken a couple brothers to them, um, and if they don't listen to them, then you take it to the church, and if they don't listen to that, you treat it like a Gentile. But we still have the hope that the Lord will deal with them in the end. Versus a false... Now, if they come out with false teaching, then you have to rebuke that openly. False teaching is something that affects all kinds of people, especially if they've got a public platform. But that's the extent of it. You know, if they have a false teaching, you address that, but you don't go and question whether they're saved if they possess the testimony of Christ. Now, I may have suspicions, but I'm going to wait for that to be open. I'm going to wait, because if they're not a true believer, eventually they're going to say something that totally betrays that they do not believe in the salvation of Christ, and they resist eternal security, or they're backloading works, or something where they deny the efficacy of the blood, is really what that comes down to. But if they don't, and they get caught up in something, or they erroneously teach false doctrine, or they get into some kind of sin, there's another way to deal with that, because they're in the church. They're brothers and sisters versus antichrists. And in the scripture, we see Paul calling out people that are clearly not believers by name. Alexander the coppersmith, Hymenaeus and Alexander, people who taught falsely against the work of Christ and hindered his ministry. Okay? But when it comes to the brother, for example, in Corinth, he didn't even give us his name. And we know he dealt with him very severely, but he turned him over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of Jesus Christ. And that brother actually repented. We have no idea what that brother's name is. Why? Because he's a brother. And love covers a multitude of sins. That's not to say that they won't be disciplined. That's not to say that the Lord won't deal with them severely. And that's not to say that we should continue to fellowship with them if we know they're in sin. And if they're teaching, we have to expose the teachings. But it is a different kind of handling of a brother than someone who is on the outside. And you can see that delineated through scripture. And Paul's, like in Philippi, in his letter to the Philippians, he said, some preach the gospel out of selfish ambition and contention, not purely thinking to add affliction to my bonds. But what shall I say? Christ is preached, and in that I rejoice, and I will rejoice. What? Well, they must have been preaching the proper Christ, because if they were preaching false doctrine, he would have said they're preaching another Christ, another spirit, another gospel, right? They're cursed. No, he didn't say that. He said some are preaching with an evil motive, thinking to add affliction to his bonds. They were apparently preaching the true thing, and he rejoiced that the true thing was being preached. So that's just an example of how we see him dealing with matters inside the church versus the Judaizers. He says, beware the dogs, beware the concision, and he says he wishes they'd cut themselves off, So when it comes to someone you suspect as being a terror, but they have the testimony of Christ, you have to be careful. Versus someone who comes against the testimony of Christ, you wait until they are ultimately manifested before you go exposing and calling people out by name and all that. That's my policy, I guess. There's a couple sisters who are hooked up with all this date setting stuff, and that needs to be rebuked, but some of them are genuine. At least they're holding on to the testimony of grace and contending for it, even though they're erroneous on all this other stuff. In my mind, that's different than the ones who are obviously like witches coming against grace, coming against the gospel, and making threats to everybody. So that's just my 2 cents about that. I had to go. I'm keeping these short. Talk to you later.